Friends, countrymen, it is good to see you all again. My name is King Legion, and I've been gone for quite some time. I've gone underground. I'm hiding out. But I'm still your king. And today we have something very important to talk about. Gun control in America. It's not a simple topic, yet it's always treated like it is. We see the continued machinations of those on the left crying out for more and more gun control, even the possible taking of all the guns in America via force. On the right, we see many clutching to their firearms. Give me liberty, give me death. And many of them jump straight to the ideals of no gun control whatsoever. I'm here to tell you that this situation is much more complicated than that. With the most recent Parkland shooting, we can't afford to boil it down to a single variable. This is important. And I feel like there's some facts that we need to get straight. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and write off the extremes. They are not tenable, they are not constitutional, and they won't work. The extremes being absolute abolition, and the other extreme being no regulations at all. These are untenable positions, and I will not be referring to them. To some degree or another, we all have to recognize that there are some forms of gun control that we are all in favor of. And I'm not saying that we're all in favor of the same ones. Some to a more degree, some to a lesser degree. This is important. These situations are complicated, and we cannot afford to base our decisions on pure emotion. The Parkland shooting was a tragedy, and nobody denies that. Not a single person. Okay? That needs to be made clear. We all need to recognize it for what it is, a tragedy, and we all do. And if you know anybody who doesn't, then they're an unfeeling human being. What are some of the facts? Let's be clear. The Parkland school shooter has had a long trail of evidence leading up to his crime. The FBI was warned a month ahead of time through an anonymous tip that the man who conducted the Parkland school shooting, who I will not name here, was doing or giving off the warning signs that he might commit this act. The FBI admitted via press release that protocol was not followed after receiving that tip, and they are currently doing an investigation to determine why that tip was not followed and why it was not investigated. That shows clear incompetence to one of the highest degrees. It's unfortunate. This could have been stopped had that tip been investigated. Moving on, of course, aside from all the people screaming that guns need to be taken away, what other options do we have? Because frankly, it comes to show that it would be untenable to take all of the guns. It would be expensive. It would take manpower that isn't available. People are not going to willingly give them up. The vast majority of Americans are for gun rights. So in order to take all the guns, you're going to have to violate the rights of the American citizen. Now, regardless of whether you think guns are fundamental rights or not, the clear distinction is that America is a gun culture. That is the difference between us and the European powers. We are a gun culture. There are 300 million guns approximately on the streets. They're not going to go anywhere. So what other options do we have? I think it becomes clear when looking at some of the data, which I will go ahead and explain to you today, that there are other options we have to consider. It is my firm belief that guns are the symptom and not the problem. Philip Lazarus, Director of Psychology Training, stated that more mental health services, particularly for students, and intervention as early as possible can help to deal with this crisis we are facing today. Many of these school shooters have long trails. They leave evidence over a long period of time. If you have any doubt in that, I recommend that you read the journals of the Columbine shooters. As graphic and as horrible as they may be, they shed some light on the mindset of kids in these situations. Intervention as early as possible can lead to these kids getting the help they need before they decide to enact a heinous act. The FBI released a report in 2000 says that increased threat assessment alongside mental health would be vastly important for determining who is a higher risk and getting them the help they need or getting them arrested before they can commit a murder. Dewey Cornell, professor at the University of Virginia, states that school building security is terribly short-sighted. We cannot rely on the pure security of the building to ward off these threats. Access controls, ID cards, these won't stop a shooter who already has access to the building. Those won't necessarily stop those students. Intervention and threat assessment is one of the best options. I will also state this, that some of you have likely heard the statement that 18 school shootings have occurred in 2018. Allow me to be clear. That is a misleading statistic. You first have to define what you mean by a school shooting. Now, these school shootings that we're referring to that were similar to Parkland, there have been 3 others in 2018. The rest were either suicides, gunshots fired into the building in which there were no injuries, or fights that broke out in the parking lot of the school but are still considered school shootings. What's the problem? I think guns are the symptom. Now there's some more statistics. Now it is clear that the more widely available the guns, the more harm is committed with them. I won't deny that. The more prevalent a weapon, the more likely it is to be used. That's the end-all be-all. America is a gun culture. But there's also evidence to show that the availability of guns prevents or stops some crimes. That can't be denied either. Now you might think the correlation between the two might matter. Unfortunately, those two statistics do not necessarily correlate. But they both must be considered, and they're both important. Now, why is the gun prevalence and the overall murder rate so close? It says here, gun prevalence and the overall murder rate is correlated to 0.67, while it is 0.84 between handgun prevalence and the murder rate. Significant to the 0.01 level, as in those are correlated statistics. Very unlikely to not have something to do with one another. But how do we explain some of that? The European nations, we don't see those kinds of problems, but that's because America is a gun culture. On top of that, the European nations have the social solidarity that America lacks. We are a heterogeneous society. Most European nations are more homogeneous than us. These situations are complicated, and all factors must be considered. What about middle ground options? Have any of you thought to consider middle ground options? It's been brought up before, common sense gun control. What does that statement mean? Well, it's simple. Common sense to one is not common sense to another. Common sense gun control is not something we can rely on. Instead, we have to look at middle ground options. So what about socioeconomic factors? Cultural factors? What about crime-ridden areas? Generally poorer areas? And unfortunately, the reality of the situation is this. It is often controlled that the higher the concentration of African Americans in an area, the higher the gun-related crime. That can widely be attested or widely attributed to the socioeconomic factors of African Americans in the United States. How can we solve that? That is a separate issue. But something we can consider. I apologize for the noise. The ultimate thing we must realize is that with gun-related deaths, most are not school shootings. School shootings play a very small role. Instead, we have suicides accounting for the majority. What are the middle ground options? I think it's necessary that we look at these mental health services. I think it's necessary that we look at mental health intervention. And I think it's necessary that we take options which do not pry the weapons from the hands of law-abiding citizens. Because any attempt to do so would be bad policy. Consider instead one option that was proposed, wherein unless a gun was properly stored in a household, the gun owner was responsible for any and all things that happened with it. We can make this about personal responsibility. Instead, the guns are blamed. Remember, these events are important. These factors are complicated. What do you think we should do? Go ahead and leave a comment down below. I'll be sure to respond to all of them. Subscribe, like, and enjoy the rest of your night, Kingdom. This has been King Legion. Take care.